and avoiding civil wars. But in South Africa, it's not a just society. Haven't achieved justice. Far from it. One of the most unjust societies in the world, with the biggest cleavage between the rich and the poor. And then the rich happens to be white and the poor happens to be black, mainly, to generalize. This is what we can call enduring justice here. So if we think a little about, reflect on what justice would mean here, we usually start from the liability model of justice, where truth, reconciliation are component, or at least truth is a component. You get the truth, what happened in history. You have to acknowledge it, and not least the one who is the colonizer has to acknowledge it. This happened. Apologize for it, and perhaps also sometimes compensate the victims. That is usually what we mean when we talk about historical justice in the respect of truth and reconciliation, because reconciliation can then hopefully follow from this. But how to overcome this, what Iris Marion Young called the structural injustice, the structures that were created during this period of who are in power, who are the powerless. How to overcome this, how to overcome the violations that continue, enduring violations of human dignity in the system. That is the big challenge, I think, when we discuss truth and reconciliation and what comes afterwards. So, historical justice look at history, of course, but the point is mainly not to blame, although sometimes you have to blame. And that was just the thought I had yesterday when I heard about the Danish reaction to the Greenland Commission. They were afraid that they should be blamed. But if there are good reasons to blame, you should be blamed. If you have good reasons for guilt, you should be guilty and do something about your guilt. So I think that it was a really bad argument for not involving Denmark in this, which was mainly from the Danish side, as I understand it. But still, the main is not to look at history, but to look at the future. How can we change the relation so the people in some way are treated with equal respect? I mean, that is the main goal here. So why rectification? Why should we bother about this? Jana Thompson, an Australian philosopher, writes, to be worthy of respect, a nation has to prepare to fulfill its historical responsibilities. This goes, I think, too, and some countries take it more serious than others, obviously, in the present history. Hopefully, France will take it now when it comes to African art. You don't really know. Now it's a little shaky, this project of art, the art project in France. Britain, some actions. Denmark against Greenland would be one issue here, of course, also to be prepared to fulfill. Help victims to cope with the past. That is, of course, often, if you know much more about them, I do, why this is important. Because victims, when it's acknowledged that they were suffering, this is all have often been very helpful. To restore the dignity of the victim, to see that I am an equal member of the human family. And of course, it's a condition for reconciliation, to find a different future. So, thank you for your attention. This final photo I take myself in Kenya, in Nairobi. It's one of the results of this example we saw in the beginning here with the Mau Mau fighters going to London. It resulted in at least an apology. It resulted in some also compensation to the 5,000 victims of this policy that are still alive. It also resulted in a monument in Nairobi remembering of this dark period in history. So thank you.
Just one moment. Would you please go back to the previous slide? Thank you very much, Jan. And our next speaker is Ande.
Imagine if one has a historical opportunity to become a link in an important chain. For example, those who in their day were one link in the chain of Enlightenment philosophy. We are in a similar situation in our day, because if this project of reconciliation, if that succeeds, it will be as important for human civilization as Enlightenment philosophy was in its day. Because that would be a way to organize our common civilization in a different framework. And that is a huge, huge thing. And it is a gift that life has given us, that we live now and we have that very opportunity to be a link in the chain of reconciliation. Imagine if they in the history in the future will write that that was the time of reconciliation, when reconciliation was developed. But to make a new chain is a very challenging task, and we have to be aware of that. There will be a lot of trial and error in this development process. So, for example, one of the common notions in the Sami Norwegian context used to be that it is a Sami problem, this Norwegianization policy. It is a Sami problem. And then we come close to this problem that the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim. Is it only the victim's problem, or is it also the perpetrator's problem? Imagine that if I was at a dinner last night, and then I became very drunk, and I said very bad things to my table companions. And then this morning I was so drunk that I didn't remember exactly what I said and how it was said, and then
I remember.
Then you remember that, and you come to me and you say that Ante, you said such and such, and you even slammed the table, and you did certain things that are not morally acceptable. That very situation will become very challenging. It is challenging for the victims of what I did next to the table. That I called them different things, and maybe I was also a little bit violent against them. So it is very challenging on the victim's side. But what about the challenges for the perpetrator? Would I like to hear what I have been doing? last night, even if it's true. It's several of my table companions confirm that, yeah, that was what you did last night, and you said so and so. So then I meet the dilemma of the perpetrator, and that can be a challenging situation. We meet that situation maybe every time that a criminal case is litigated in court, that a perpetrator gets to hear what he has done there. And in a similar situation are the governments. If we then intend that our relationship should be productive also in the future, that we should have more dinners together, and that we had that history together, because during that process a fruit that we could get would be that you got to know me a little bit better and I got to know you a little bit better, and perhaps our conversations would be more fruitful because of that. So we could all benefit from a reconciliation based on that very unfortunate episode last night. But I end up in this situation that either I could start a fight, I could blame the victims, blame you that you were so boring that you irritated me, or that that you bumped into me, or something that triggered my response. Or I could fly from the process that when you confront me with what did you do last night by the table, then I could say that we could talk about that, but I don't have time right now. We have to speak about that later, and then I could run away. So then I could either choose to fight, or a fight or a flight from the situation. And the system of that, if we choose a third way, that we could try to reconciliate, then we would it can be a very exhausting process. It can be an exhausting process for the perpetrator. And somehow when if we then use this concept of historical injustice, and we could also have historical responsibility. We could also have the spouse of historical responsibility, collective responsibility, that we could say that it was these bad individuals who did these horrifying things, but we are different individuals. We are more enlightened, and we don't do such things as they have been doing. And we could then make a conceptual framework where we try to organize that unfortunate situation. The thing when we apply that to society, when a society is a kind of perpetrator, we have already seen that it could be very challenging for an individual, an unfortunate individual who hasn't behaved at the dinner last night. But what if the society is a perpetrator and the victim comes with the argument of historical responsibility and collective responsibility? So that is conceptually a demanding situation, as we have seen in Göran's presentation here. So, and one shadow of that is that it is also complicated to communicate to a society. And and if we then look further into the perpetrating societies, if we look at that as a Norwegian problem, a Swedish problem, a Canadian problem, a New Zealand problem, an Australian problem, etc., then one part of the thing is that the populations of these countries, they are also victims of propaganda. Propaganda by omission. That information about the indigenous cultures haven't been provided to the populations. The schools have been very silent about the existence of the indigenous cultures, the structure of the indigenous cultures, the history of the indigenous cultures, and so on. And I wish that the situation had been good in Norway, as you mentioned yesterday, Ketil, but Hadi Lile's PhD, where he went into and investigated the cultural literacy among teachers and children about Sami culture. His PhD was published, was it in 2013 or 2012? So he in his research demonstrated that the ignorance is huge, and I have metaphorized that the Norwegian ignorance about the Sami culture, that it's the big ocean, a big black ocean of ignorance, and that big black ocean has the liquid in that ocean is like syrup, that it's very slow, and that is a challenge. And I have also first-hand experience what happens to a population that then understands that there have been information that hasn't been provided to me. We know the reaction of a judge if you sit here as a judge and then somebody has omitted evidence from you. They haven't told you the truth and nothing but the whole truth, but they have let something out. The judge will be very disappointed and perhaps angry. And I was in Oslo in 1979 when the first hunger strike was happened, and the population of Oslo, when they became aware of the policy of Norwegianization, so they filled the streets in Oslo. The streets in Oslo were even more filled up during in 1979 during the hunger strike than they were when Norway got free from the German occupation in 1945. and it was a huge anger there, that has such things been happening in our name. So that is a challenge that that is on the hands. That what should one do with the population that is has not been informed, and the population that maybe is pretty illiterate on structural things, historical responsibility, collective responsibility. So, so that is one of the big challenges that we also need to focus on when we are discussing the reconciliation system. I have met the sort of the structure because when we go into the perpetrator as a structure, how is the perpetrator structured? So I happen to be a boarding school child, meaning that that when I was 12 years old, then I was sent off to boarding school, and I got my sort of last good night hug when I was 12. So because then I had to be in the boarding school with a different structure and go through the pain and anger that a child experiences in such a situation. So I made two very important decisions in that anger, because I still carry that anger in me, and it is sort of my battery that I think will last for eternally. And I decided, the first decision was that I will fucking become a lawyer. So that is the civilized way to fight. So I would wanted to fight back. And the second major decision I made there was that I need to make sure of that joiking will not die out. So I became very serious about joiking. Started to train techniques, started to go around to different good joikers and ask them to joik. And that was a very interesting process to go through, because I met the joik was covered under a thick blanket of shame. So I really had to beg these people, I have heard that you were such a good joiker, could you please joik one for me? And then I ended up publishing my mother and father on a record, and I ended up publishing 2 CDs with my uncle. And it was so amazing, in particular the shame that was there, because joiking had different layers of shame. One was the religious shame, that it was a pagan, it was the devil's music, and another layer was that it was so ugly, and a third layer was that it was so out of fashion. That was something one did long time ago, and so on. So the recording sessions with my uncle were very interesting, because he was technically superb. And the first recording would go like good, the second would be better, third would be perfect, fourth perfect, fifth perfect, sixth. Then he would start to look at me as the devil, that he is here with his temptations, making me to sin, and then that wouldn't go well, and then he would then just take off and leave our. He was visiting in our home, so he would leave then. No goodbye, no nothing. I have to get rid of the devil and run off. And then after a week he would return, and he would then again agree to make a recording, and we would have the same thing happening over again. So as a producer, I had to make sure of that. I should get every yoik as the 4th and 5th recording, so that I would get it as good as it could be. And that was a very learning experience. This when you are ashamed of yourself, you don't hate yourself, but you are ashamed of yourself, and how one should structure that. It ended with my uncle. It had this beautiful ending, because when we then published his record, and he was a superb joiker. So we went to the Riddo festival there, and there was this ocean of young people who were very, very happy for his CD. And that is the most beautiful thing I have seen, when he met these young people, and I had seen his shame in the everyday life. So the thing is that we need to, that one step is that we need to understand the structure of the perpetrator, and we need to understand the perception of shame that is in the victims. So go view the victim as a structure that has different layers, because different layers will require different approaches, and that will also be the situation with the perpetrator. That we need to understand the structure of the perpetrator, because it can also be challenging. The housewife of my boarding school, because my boarding school experience was, of course, this personal pain, with this anger that never leaves me, but I use it in as productively as I can. And then the second thing was my mother. She cried when I left home, and she continued to cry very much when I went to the university, and when I started to work and came visiting. She cried for a whole day when I left, and it took me a long time to understand what her cry was about. That she was not only crying for me, but she was crying for all of us 4 children that she had lost to the boarding school system. So the pain of the parent has been also manifested. But the third layer was the sort of the representative of the perpetrator, and it was the housewife, it was called in the boarding school, the woman who was in charge of the system there. She was a Sami girl, and she was retired, and I by then was working as a practicing lawyer, and I met her, and she said to me that, and I'm so sorry for the time in the boarding school. I tried to be smooth and nice, and I said that, well, we are all children of our time, so I don't carry any blame towards you. And then she said, but Ande, I'm so sorry for the time in the boarding school. And I again tried to rephrase my smoothness, saying that, yeah, I understand that, but it was different times. And then she said for the third time that, but Ande, I'm so sorry for the boarding school. At that moment, I understood that it's not possible to be in a hurry in this moment. So I sat down with her and basically heard her personal story of the boarding school, because one of the traps is that this oppression can be privatized to these people who were in the first line of that, like the teachers who met the children, the boarding school personnel, and so on, because they were also our own people. So I sat there and listened to her, and the metaphor that I got there was that she was in the locomotive of a train that she couldn't stop. So imagine to be in that situation, and you see this animal that the train will roll over. So so I think that there will be a lot of conceptual work that has to be done, and making such a contribution to the civilization of the future, if we succeed, can be demanding. For example, when it comes to responsibility, then we are used to think responsibility in a human perception, like long time. What is long time? Long time ago that this happened. If we think of a human life, where the legal instruments of responsibility, they are designed on the presumption that we are talking about humans. But when it comes to states, national states, and also corporations, they live much longer than a human. So what is a long time for a human doesn't necessarily apply to what is a long time to a state. So it could be that when Hong Kong was delivered back to China, that in the way a state maybe perceives time is different than how a human perceives time. We perceive time that we start to remember maybe 5, 6 years old, and we remember maybe till we are 95 years old. So we have a time span when we can perceive time, but these superstructures will have a different perception of time. And what we need to do is that we need to sort of understand that, and then try to operationalize that, such types of facts, and then try to design the reconciliation process. So I want to wish you the best of luck to be as good of a link in that very important chain that can be one of the golden chains in the history of humanity. if we succeed.
And where's the joy?
Yeah. I actually said something by the table yesterday. And that was that I promised to Joik. And I can Joik, the Tromsø island Joik. It is a special Joik because it is I happen to be a person who new Joiks come to me. So this Joik came to me in 1994, just a few years after that I moved to Tromsø. And also the poem came, and the poem says that Tromsø Island, the jewel of the north, when time was winter, she was so elegantly well dressed in white, snow white. No wonder that the aurora was joiking her so intensively. When time was summer, the rainbow was her jewelry. No wonder that the polar ocean was caressing her so gently. And the people, the generous people, Tromsø Island, the jewel of the north, and it goes like this. Om sa sol cha ole yolo yola yongo Tavi mailme gealole yogo Alve naikele ino chingalan yola yongo Kapan are kapan chingalan Auto oito sa nu yo yo ka jidan unna sullo cha yo Asinaike ilan unnit chingalan yogo Arve tauke sole yonle yogo No hauska solomo cha solutjelo yongo chomilla sale jego rom sa solo cha ole yo yo yongo Avi mailme gealole yo A little bit of our tiny little island where we live.
Thank you so much for this very moving performance. I think we made Dee's history. It's probably the first time that has ever been singing on this stage. But this is, thank you so much. I'm really moved now. So it will be hard to present the next speaker, but let's welcome the floor to Inge Husseiding, who will speak on archives. I know this will be some of a change, but I know Inge is the right person to show us